Good morning, Malaysia. We are Group 8 presenting a documentary about how the government contained inflation in Malaysia. Our group consists of 5 members, which includes me, Cliff Julius, NURSAHFIRAH binti SAPRI, CHARIE, Samuel NURZAFIRAH binti ABDURAHMAN, and TABITHA GILINGAN. What is inflation? Inflation is the rate at which prices rise over a given period of time. Inflation is typically defined as a broad measure such as the overall prices increase or the cost of living in a country. However, it can also be calculated more precisely for specific goods such as food or services such as a haircut. Inflation represents how much more expensive a particular set of goods and services has become over a specific period, most commonly a year. As we are facing now, many people must wonder how this inflation affects people's life. Many people wonder if this inflation is a good or a bad thing. When inflation is moderate, it is beneficial. There are 2 scenarios in which this occurs. The first is when inflation causes consumers to expect prices to rise further. People prefer to buy now rather than pay more later when prices rise. In the short term, this increases demand. As a result, stores are selling more and factories are producing more. To meet the demand, they are more likely to hire new employees. It starts a virtuous cycle that boosts economic growth. The second is when it eliminates the possibility of deflation, that is when prices drop. When this occurs, people wait to see if the prices fall further before purchasing. It reduces the demand and causes businesses to reduce inventory. As a result, factories are producing less and laying off employees. Wage deflation occurs as unemployment rises. Workers have less money to spend, which further reduces demand. Companies reduce their prices. This exacerbates deflation. As a result, deflation is more damaging to economic growth than inflation. During the global Great Depression, price fell by 10%. When inflation exceeds 2%, it becomes dangerous. Walking inflation occurs when prices rise by 3% to 10% per year. It has the potential to drive excessive economic growth. Inflation at that level robs you of your hard-earned ringgits. Prices of everyday items are rising faster than wages. Walking inflation means now it costs 24 ringgits to buy what 1 ringgit was purchased in 1913. The essential takeaway: inflation is beneficial when it offsets the effect of deflation, which is often detrimental to an economy. Second, when consumers anticipate higher prices, they spend now, boosting economic growth. Finally, managing expectation of future inflation are essential to maintain a reasonable inflation rate. To summarize, mild inflation is beneficial to the economy. Consistent inflation is valuable because it keeps the economy in a stimulated cycle, therefore boosting economic growth. Maintaining a consistent level of inflation is critical for consumers, workers, and business to survive. Thank you.
Okay, and the causes of inflation in Malaysia will easily be blamed on the pandemic, where we quickly see the demand and supply abrupt. But inflation in Malaysia is more than caused by the pandemic. It is affected by the government internal management. The most known cause of inflation is wage boost inflation. The increase in wages has raised the cost of goods and service. It is due to increased aggregate demand, or the number of goods and services the entire population typically buys in a plain situation. When there is a salary increase, the money to purchase goods and services is there. Still, the supply to the customer needs is limited, which as a result, the supplier will take the opportunity to raise whatever price they are willing to pay, thus creating them full inflation. Secondly, causing inflation in Malaysia is food price, where are attributed to the further depreciation of the US ringgit. The cost boost inflation occurs when it is persistent in the rise of costs. This is due to the increase in the production for many reasons, such as the increase in the price of raw materials, the rise in wages, and the political situation in Malaysia. For example, during the GE15, the depreciation of the US ringgit was worse, almost toward 5 ringgit. When the new government of the day had been decided, the Malaysia currency rate against the US dollar went to 4.40 ringgit. Hence, this shows the unstable government and squabbling politicians are one of the reasons. In perspective, investor or business peoples will not deal with a country that keeps changing PM or government because that translates to involving policy. And then thirdly, the main new cause of inflation, where all the rakyat Malaysia have to pay more for the same basket of goods and services. The overall price level has gone up, which affected the consumers and lead to the purchasing power of the consumers. As a result, they become worse off. Moreover, this also caused shock demand, which many economists speculated. The news regarding the future price will increase by common sense and will make people buy goods in a large quantity, making certain goods out of demand. To reduce the demand, local retail will hide the stock and increase the price of goods, increasing the inflation rate. And now pass to my next colleague. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cherry Samuel. Today I would like to present about the effect of inflation. The effect of inflation on the economy of Malaysia can be separated into 3 sectors. First is the economy industry with rising inflation. The current economic condition present numerous business challenges to a manufacturing company. This also include the increase in raw material price, freight and transportation costs, wages and salaries, energy costs, and the shortage of work in Malaysia. Malaysia is still concerned about the fragile supply chain, which may be subject to further interruption, the unpredictable outcome of the ongoing war in Ukraine also add on element of the uncertainty toward them. Many companies are purchasing commodity and stock in large quantity to secure the item current price out of fear of another supply chain issue, which allow manufacturer to produce more of a product and sell it successfully. Some are willing to pay more upfront to ensure the product are delivered on time and when they need it. This allows manufacturers to charge more as these manufacturing setbacks have delayed the project, making the project more and more expensive. Others are taking a wait-and-see attitude, but at the risk of missing opportunity. For an example, there is a significant emphasis on tracking where and when to purchase goods at the most favorable prices and from precise location. The second is economy services. Inflation measures how fast price for goods and services such as gasoline, food, clothing, rent, travel, and health care are increasing. The consumer price index, which measures changes in price for a broad basket of items, jumped into 9.1% in June versus a year earlier, the highest annual rise since November 1981. An example is an increase in the cost of goods and the surging prices of food items and essentials, forcing business owners to hike up food and the rental price to keep their businesses afloat. This may eventually lead to consumer basket size getting more and more smaller as people are unwillingly to spend more because this will cost them a lot of money. The third one is economic agriculture. Inflation pressure in the economy can put upward pressure on farm commodity price, but higher commodity price increases the demand for farm input, including the cost of borrow fund. The easiest way to remember from the latest news of the Russia and Ukraine conflict in this early 2022 led to the shortage of wheat, barley, and fertilizer. It is essential for crop cultivation, thereby contributing to higher food prices globally. Russia and Ukraine accounted for about a quarter of global wheat and barley export in 2021. On a combined basis, the two countries also exported 28% of the world fertilizers made from nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in 2021. Thus, a prolonged conflict can worsen existing supply shortage in our Malaysian agriculture market. Okay, in the conclusion for these three, the cost of living has increased significantly since June. The cost of living has also grown so much that more than 28,000 young Malaysians have declared bankruptcy this year in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. And to make things worse, our ringgit has devaluated from RM4 ringgit 39 to USD 1. All imported items will become more and more expensive, including petrol, which play a significant impact. If the inflation does not reduce by end of this year, we can expect another round of interest rate will be hikes. Thank you very much. This is from my presentation.
Next, how does the government of Malaysia contain inflation? According to Tan Sri Anwar Musa, the Communication and Multimedia Minister, inflation rates have risen worldwide, but Malaysia is still among the countries with the lowest rate of 2.8%. Even with the low inflation rates, the economy in Malaysia is still manageable. Former Alliance Bank Malaysia Chief Economist Manokaran Motain said the basket of goods used to measure inflation includes controlled items which help bring down the inflation rate. A big thanks to the subsidies provided by the government, especially in fuel and food Malaysia. Nowadays, the government contains inflation using subsidies provided by the government, especially for fuel and food in Malaysia. Started by Finance Minister Tengku Datuk Sri Zafrul Abdul Aziz on June 25 said the total subsidies of Ringgit Malaysia 77.3 billion included petrol, diesel, and liquefied petroleum gas, which is LPG, amounting to Ringgit Malaysia 37.3 billion, and cooking oil Ringgit Malaysia 4 billion, and various form of aid including the Bantuan Keluarga Malaysia, which is BKM, in Ringgit Malaysia 11.7 billion, as well as other subsidies, which is RM14.6 billion. The subsidies are beneficial to control the inflation rate. It is high time for the government to significantly implement targeted subsidies for the people to help the lower income group. Nevertheless, in terms of reducing inflation, government uses the Price Control Act to maintain inflation too stable and far from deficit. Malaysia is facing inflation. The government is putting measures to control rising food prices. According to the Department of Statistics, national inflation for January to December 2021 showed a significant increase of 2.5% compared to a negative 1.2% for the same period in 2020. Besides, Malaysia Consumer Price Index rose, which is 3.2% in December 2021 compared to a year earlier, mainly due to increasing food and fuel price. The world has COVID for the last 2 years has disrupted food supply chains. The cost of production, especially for chicken farmers, has increased tremendously. Since COVID happens, inflation has affected all over the world, including Malaysia. To control inflation, the government has utilized economic instruments using the monetary policy. The government of Malaysia uses the contractionary monetary policy as a method of controlling inflation. The Monetary Policy Committee, which is MPC of Bank Negara Malaysia, decided to increase the overnight policy rate, which is OPR, by 25 basis points to 2.75%. The ceiling and floor rates of corridor of OPR correspondingly increased to 3.00% and 2.50%. The goal of contractionary policy is to reduce the money supply within an economy by raising interest rates. This helps slow economic growth by making credit more expensive, which reduces consumer and businesses' spending. As far as we know, inflation can affect the economy, industry, financial services, and economic agriculture. The government must know how to contain inflation well and succeed, because if it fails, it will cause an economic deficit and lead to more suffering for country's people. So, the government can do it by taking steps to stabilize price on essential food items such as rice and meat to ensure that people can buy the food with the price they can afford. Knowing how to contain inflation will make the country grow more significantly and become financially stable in the future.
As we know, inflation is when there is an increase in the price of goods and services offered. When this price increase occurs, many people complain because the income they receive every month can only cover daily expenses. This inflation has significantly affected those who are particularly low income when their finances are in a state of deficit. One of how the government deals with this inflation is by providing subsidies to stabilize the price of goods and prevent the inflation rate in Malaysia from increasing to 8% to 11%. This subsidy is expected to ease the burden of the people, especially the low-income groups, such as B40, with the Malaysian government's control of the price scheme. But does this subsidy only have benefits to help the government deal with inflation? Of course not. The government needs to think sensibly not to rely on a high amount of subsidies to help the people, because these subsidies can also increase the national debt rate. Economic analysts said that the management of the economy in Malaysia in the last 2 years was aimed at balancing the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which spent a high allocation. Therefore, the government should implement an austerity plan to control the increase in the national debt that future generations will bear. The government should form a plan to provide targeted subsidies, especially for the financially disadvantaged, to improve their standard of living. Compared to the T20 group in Malaysia, it is not appropriate for them to be given subsidies from the government because they can easily buy daily necessities without thinking twice. So, now it's time for the government to ensure that only the people who need it should receive this subsidy. However, Professor Bajoyai Bardai, one of the economic analysts, states that this targeted subsidy needs to be implemented carefully, especially when reducing the amount of subsidy spent because it is feared that it will have an impact on the inflation rate suddenly. The inflation rate needs to be seen, and the subsidy distribution mechanism also needs to be made efficient so as not to give implications to the financial situation in our country. In conclusion, regarding the implementation of subsidies, the subsidies provided by the government at present are a wise solution in the short term to control the rate of inflation in the country. However, the government needs to be prepared with a long-term plan to increase economic results in the country after the pressure from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the lack of food supply that causes the price of goods to rise. In addition, a significant step taken by the Malaysian government to control inflation is implementing a contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy is implemented by raising the interest rate. Bank Negara Malaysia is expected to continue to increase interest rates to the original level before the COVID-19 pandemic, which is 3%. Bank Negara Malaysia decision to continue gradually adjusting interest rates aims to ensure price stability and better sustainability of economic growth in the long term. In our opinion, contractionary monetary policy has its advantages and disadvantages. The return of the OPR to the original level is also appropriate when the economy is gradually recovering after the OPR was lowered to the lowest level in our country, which is 1.75% during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, overall, various aspects are affected when the OPR increases again. According to economists, the increase in OPR will only cause installment payments for several types of loans, such as housing loans, personal financing, or investment financing to be raised. Professor Jomo KS described that raising interest rates will not ease inflation because the supply shock drive the cause of inflation due to COVID-19. He explained that the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has also influenced commodity prices to continue to rise when wheat exports have been affected, thus contributing to the increase in food prices. In addition, restrictions on Russian trade have also contributed to the rise in global oil prices in general. The increase in interest rates implemented by BNM has had a widespread impact on everyone when many have loans and financing. Although installment payments did not increase significantly after the OPR was gradually increased, this also brought an effect that could increase the burden on some parties, especially those with low incomes. When the OPR is raised again to 3% later, borrowers will have to pay around 25% more than during the COVID-19 pandemic. This will burden borrowers if their fixed income stays the same. Most workers in Malaysia have a salary of less than 2,500 ringgit per month, and this will have a severe impact because they spend a large part of their income on necessities that experience high inflation. According to the BNM governor, although the increase in OPR impacts borrowers through higher loan repayments, the higher rate will also benefit savers because through better deposit returns. Higher deposit returns will encourage more individuals to increase their savings to rebuild their finances affected during the COVID-19 crisis. BNM understands that there are still vulnerable borrowers. Therefore, they still provide various facilities under the BNM Fund to help small and medium enterprises SMEs, advisory services and assistance through AKPK and PPK, as well as the Small Loan Settlement Scheme, SKPK. In conclusion, all the steps taken by the government today are on the right track. Still, they need to be implemented more quickly, widely, deeply, and aggressively in implementing comprehensive reforms on economic development in Malaysia. It would be better for Malaysians to keep practicing to figure out how to manage their financial spending more carefully to avoid waste in inflation situation like now. Only buy necessary items to ensure sufficient daily expenses for the whole family. Finally, inflation is not something unique that only happens in Malaysia, but it is a global phenomenon faced worldwide.